All right, and welcome to the Awaken podcast. And today is a bit of a turning point and a shift in the podcast. And truly, I just want to frame that if you've been listening since the origin of this podcast, which was 2022, 2023, hello, and thanks for being here because we've really been on a journey together. And this podcast has taken many different shapes and forms. And so if you go all the way back, you're really going to see literally in real time the shifts and the evolutions of how I continue to weave and find and land in and stand in my own purpose and how I've really allowed that to shift and meld. And that's exactly what today's episode is going to be about. It's going to be going a little bit farther back, sharing more about my story and how standing in and living from your purpose doesn't mean staying in some kind of preset box that you thought you were supposed to stay in. Purpose also isn't this one time decision that you make, like this line in the sand moment where you decide, no, I'm not doing that. I'm standing in my purpose. And then, like, it's it, then everything's good. Purpose is a choice you make every day. And especially for the people that are listening to this, I'm talking to those that like you feel like your purpose is ebbing and flowing, and you may be a founder, a creator, a coach, an entrepreneur. You may be deeply diving into just something, a passion that you love and putting everything into it while still having a 9 to 5 because you find purpose in it, like whatever it is, you are someone who you feel deeply called to stay anchored in your purpose. And as I share this story today, it's to remind you and to reassure you that purpose is not meant to look linear. Purpose is not meant to look like, okay, I found my thing. Now I'm meant to stay in this box. And like, oh no, if it feels like I'm outgrowing it or I'm shifting or molding again, like that there's something wrong or that you got it wrong or that everything else was a failure. It's like, no, no, no. It's always deeply trusting that the journey that you're on is weaving you through, and you're, as long as you continue to keep your North Star, your purpose, your mission, what feels in alignment to you, that is what I'm diving into today. And I say that this is a pivot for the podcast because this will be the ongoing conversation that I pull and weave through. So this podcast has been a space where I've been able to share how early on in my journey and in my business, in this business, it was a lot of like, how do you manage stress? How do you manage overwhelm? How do you manage anxiety? How do you begin to build your confidence? Those were some of the early topics that I talked about on the podcast. So if you're struggling and if you're in that of like, I'm stressed, I'm overwhelmed, I'm a high achiever, go back to some of those earlier episodes, like scroll back. And also, you'll notice the podcast then all of a sudden will begin to shift. And I start to dabble into topics around healing and different modalities and tools you can use when you're on your own spiritual awakening or just like trying to find yourself a personal development journey. There was a time where I pulled in different guests, pulling in like talking about yoga, astrology, hypnotherapy, all these different things. That was the podcast. That was when I was in a season called Beyond the Mind, like going beyond just like mindset tools and diving deeper into other modalities that you can use to really get to know yourself. So that was like my Beyond the Mind series in season 2. Again, scroll back, find those if you're feeling called to. Then the podcast had like kind of its veering in its journey into, especially as I was beginning to build some different products and doing some groups within the business around intuition, spiritual awakening, how to trust your intuition, working with your guides. What does that mean? So you can find episodes that dive into the woo, shall we say. And now from here forth hence, and I've had some amazing guests on, and I'm going to keep having some amazing, brilliant guest episodes. Like whenever you're listening to this, I'm so excited. Be sure to watch some of the guest episodes that are, right before and right after the release of this podcast episode. I'm so excited for who's to come. But the podcast is really going to have this through line of, I realize now, awaken. Awaken is not just like awaken and I'm awakening to my intuition, spirituality, woo. Like if that's your journey and if that's where you're at, amazing. Awaken will continue to speak to you. But if you also just find yourself like awakening to your path, your mission, your purpose, why you've been put on the planet, and you feel this calling to live from your purpose, that's what Awaken is about. You're not only going to hear stories on my own, practical tips and strategies on how can you live from your purpose. I will share different ways that you can enter into my world, ways that we can work together, ways that I'll have anything from self-paced programs to at times maybe some live group programs. Um, all of that to say ways to support you on your journey of finding your purpose, staying in alignment to your purpose, affirming your purpose when you feel like you've been pulled off course. All of that, this is your home for that. As well as I'm super excited. I don't want finding purpose. I don't want it to look like a certain preset cookie cutter way. I think sometimes we can listen to a podcast, find a guru, which I'm not a guru. I'm not a guru. I'm not like you're your own guide. I am just a mentor here walking you through the journey that I've also walked through and am walking. But sometimes we can then land on something and be like, oh, that must be purpose. So I must have to build a business and it must look that way. That should be my purpose. Or like, oh, okay, she's doing like humanitarian work. That should be like, we can sometimes see a cookie cutter example. So I'm really excited to continue to bring on different guests onto the podcast and talk about how they are living in their purpose and how that can look different to everyone. We all have different callings in the world. And then if you do happen to be someone who your calling is to be a founder, to create something, to be an entrepreneur, I also have a CEO series where I pull in and I interview some amazing, successful powerhouse business owners, CEOs who are making 6, 7, and 8 figures. And not that the number matters, but it's just to show that when you live in your purpose, anything is possible. And I go behind the scenes with these business owners of what it really took to grow and scale their businesses and why it wasn't all just strategy, 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 and how it has so much to do with leadership, how you lead yourself, the inner work, the shadow work, the work that you're willing to do on yourself. Because at the end of the day, you are the channel. You are the channel to which everything flows through. And it's why it's so important when you're creating something, building something, following your dream, following your heart. You cannot avoid the inner work, getting to know yourself, tapping into your own gifts, also looking at your karma and your shadow work. All of it is so important. So I just want to say this is the home for all of that on the Awaken podcast. And today I want to share how purpose will ebb and flow and how I landed in the work that I get to do today, which I am deeply honored to be able to get to do this work. But you may see me at my journey now, and it may look like, wow, like that must be nice. Like she's in her passion, she's in her purpose. She must have always known she wanted to do this. And some of you've been following the journey, you know that that wasn't the case. Or maybe you look at me and I'm fairly woo and fairly connected to my intuition. Also, I love to be grounded and practical and give you grounded practical tools as you listen along. But I haven't always been woo. So let me go back to a time where I thought I was doing everything right. I thought I was doing what I was supposed to do, what my purpose was. Like I thought I knew until I didn't, until I had done everything right. And then I landed in a job and well, I was 25 and I thought I was going to be my dream job. Like, this is my purpose. And it wasn't. Okay, so let me take you back. If you're like me, maybe you feel like you were given a roadmap as a child. Okay, I grew up in the 90s, born in the 90s, I'm a 90s girl, 2000s. If you come from this time where I feel like many of us were raised by parents who had kind of sold us the American dream, and depending on whatever maybe their story was, but ultimately they wanted better for us. And so the path that was sold to us was, at least to me, was go to college. Okay. After high school, go to college, get into a good college program. And that's not even good enough. You have to like go get a master's or a doctorate, like achieve the highest level of education that you can, which again, there's nothing wrong with education. I'm extremely grateful for the education that I have. But it was like go to the tippy top just because it's on the ladder, it's on the rung. Okay. So I climbed that rung. And then, it was like get a stable career, get a stable, respectable career, make some good money, and stay in that for 30 plus years because that's what both my parents did. My mom was a nurse for 30 plus years and she climbed the career ladder of nursing. Going from like just being a nurse to then being a shift nurse, shift manager, to then nursing supervisor, to ultimately she was the director of nursing at a local rural hospital. And then my dad also was very in a stable career and he was very loyal to the company that he worked for. And it was a road construction company. And he was with them for 30, 35 plus years. And so it was like, okay, go to school, get an education, get a stable job. That's the goal. That's the purpose. And so I did the things. And because my mom was in healthcare, I was like, okay, healthcare seems like a very stable career choice. Like I can do that. I can go into healthcare. I definitely didn't want to be a nurse. Okay. Like I worked at a nursing home back in high school. I also did some job shadowing and I was like, oh, I don't have the stomach for nursing. There was just certain elements of it that I was like, no, this is not for me. So I began to explore other things in kind of that healthcare realm and I landed in occupational therapy. And I was like, okay, this feels like something I can do. And at the time, I was very set on like working in a hospital because that's where my mom worked. And I feel like part of my childhood, I was like raised in a hospital. My mom we'd sometimes, especially once she was in a more manager and then a director of nursing role, she might have wrapped up with work, but then after we had supper, she maybe had to go back in for something. She would sometimes teach a nighttime diabetes class on helping people manage their diabetes, but it was like an evening afternoon thing that I'd have to go back to the hospital with her for. Or she maybe just had to go back in and wrap up some paperwork or whatever it was. So I just feel like there were times where I had to go in with her and I was just hanging out in the hospital. And the hospital felt kind of like home. And so when I was shadowing for occupational therapy, I kind of was like, okay, I'll do more of like a medical model. I'll be an OT in a hospital. I ended up getting my master's degree. I'd done an internship actually at Mayo Clinic, which is here in where I ended up residing in Rochester, Minnesota at the time of this recording. Number one hospital, not just in the state, it's the number one hospital in the world. And I was like, this is where I want to work. Now, when I graduated, Mayo was on a hiring freeze. So I was like, okay. So went and worked in a skilled nursing facility, doing rehab, oftentimes with older adults or people post surgery that needed rehab. And so I did OT there for a year, and then all of a sudden Mayo's hiring freeze lifted, and I was like, okay, this is my window. Apply for the job, get the job, of course, right? Of course, this was my dream. Started working at Mayo. And I appreciated and really loved as an OT, you're part of an OT, you're like the rehab department. And I loved the kinship. I loved the mentorship there. But at the end of the day to day of being an OT in the hospital was not for me. It's a lot of when you're in the hospital, for the most part, people really don't want to do rehab. They literally want to know, like, where's the nurse? Where's my meds? Where's the doctor? I want to know what's happened to me and when do I get out of here? Or where's the dietitian or not the dietitian? Where's like the food people? Like, I want to put my order in. Those are like the main people that people want to see when you walk into their hospital room. When you go in and you say, hi, I'm with therapy, I'm with OT or whatever, it's like instant, no, thank you. I don't I don't want to get out of bed today. I don't want to brush my teeth today. It ultimately we were supporting them in rehabbing and getting back their energy, their endurance, their strength for whatever they were in the hospital for. Also as OTs, one thing I did love, but was also hard. We got to do cognitive evals on people. And so oftentimes when someone's in the hospital for whatever reason, their mental state can be altered. Maybe they're not getting sleep, maybe it's due to medication or surgery. And so as OTs, we'd oftentimes have to go in and do cognitive evals and assess, how is their cognition? Is their cognition coming back? And are they safe to leave the hospital? Are they safe to go home, either with family or by themselves? And sometimes we would even maybe catch some underlying cognitive decline things that had been happening probably even well before the hospitalization, that then we would have to have some tricky conversations with family members on, whether it's like, maybe your family member's dealing with a mental health issue that's impacting their cognition. Maybe there is some early stage Alzheimer's or just age related cognitive decline. And we would have to start initiating those conversations. Now, I did not mind that aspect of the job, but what I didn't like was, again, in the hospital setting as an OT, you don't really get to build long-term connection with people. The hospital is set up, which I understand, is set up from such a way of like they need to get people in and out. They need to prioritize getting the right people who need the medical attention in the hospital beds. And, there's just a length of stay that they want to stay to. And I found that like I hated that because for the people who did actually maybe like doing some rehab, I would begin to build a connection with them. I always was so interested in like just going deep with people, getting to know them, even if we were whatever I was working on with them. If I was helping them with brushing their teeth to build up their endurance again, or helping them relearn how to, get their clothes on, maybe after they had a stroke or a hip surgery and I had to teach them tools, whatever it is we were doing. I loved the conversation. I loved getting to know these people. I loved getting to know what made them tick and how could I help them in a little way just be and feel better, not even related to whatever we were working on physically, but like I always would love going into kind of the emotional side of things or what was going on in their world and always ended up on like, maybe stress management or mental health, things like that, or even just like, how can you like do more of your passions? It sounds like you're really stressed or whatever it was. But quickly, again, due to hospital turnaround, it just felt kind of empty, like not really ever being able to follow up with people. So, amongst that and some other reasons, while I was also trained in the outpatient pain rehab program at Mayo, which again, I really loved. In the outpatient pain rehab program, we would get people coming from all over the world coming to Mayo to figure out like they had to meet criteria, but they'd had chronic pain, oftentimes multifactorial related to so many different things. Oftentimes there was a mental health stress component though. And they'd ultimately come to Mayo as like a last ditch effort of like, what do I do? And they would stay with us for 3 weeks and I'd get to see them every day. And I loved that. But then again, then they would leave and they would like leave the bubble of Mayo and this beautiful program and system that we helped them with managing their pain. And there was so many amazing success stories and also some not. But then I hated like then they would leave and then they'd go back to their everyday lives and I would be like how are they doing? How like are they doing okay now functioning in their everyday real life? And I was like I want to follow them. So for all these different various reasons, I you can hear like there were elements of the job that I loved and also elements that were like draining me and didn't feel aligned. And ultimately, I wound up in this anxious depression cycle. And I hated going into work. And it didn't make sense because on some level I knew I was meant to be helping people. I knew that that was my purpose of like I meant to help people, but not like surface level, not just like help them and not that, that surface level, but like not just help them brush their teeth, not just like do a quick cog eval and then say bye, see you out the door, but like really get to know people and help them. And I wasn't able to do that in the hospital setting. And it on paper didn't make sense. That's where this like anxious depression cycle began while I was working at Mayo and began to realize like this is not for me. This is not going to be my forever job. The tension was why is this not working for me? Why don't I like this? Why can't I just make this work? So anxious because of like I'm stressed. What do I do? What am I going to do with my life? I just spent over 50K on a master's degree and now I don't even like this. So anxious. What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? And also just anxious, like it can be stressful working in a hospital setting. The depression was coming in. I'd have these cycles because it was just like my soul was feeling empty and unfulfilled. Ultimately, I am I am a mental health practitioner. I was a mental health practitioner. I did work in mental health. But with that, I say I am not, do not take this as not real medical or mental health advice, or how do I want to say this? With depression, yes, like I'm not here to say like there's also other underlying etiology, but I just want to say, at least for me, this depression was a disconnection. It was a disconnection from my purpose. Oftentimes, depression can be disconnection, disconnected from your purpose, disconnected from people, and not having a sense of belonging. Those things can contribute to feelings of depression. And that's what I was feeling, disconnected from my true purpose. This is not what I'm meant to do. And so I ran this way for a while. And for a while, when you think you know your purpose and you go into it and you do the thing, or you found the career or whatever it is, and it makes sense on paper, and it's like, I should like this. This makes me money. Why do I not? I tried to ignore it, deny it until I couldn't any longer. And finally, it was just right around my 2 year anniversary of being at Mayo. And ironically, there were other colleagues that I worked with at Mayo who, like, they didn't maybe love it, but they could do the job day to day. But they knew, many of my colleagues knew, like, it wasn't lighting me up. It was starting to impact my mental health. And honestly, people were saying, like, if you're going to get out, you got to get out now, because they would call it the gold handcuffs. And so if you work at Mayo, there's some amazing benefits that you can begin to get once you're vested. And I want to say it's around like the 3, 4, and 5 year mark once you're there for that long, because some additional benefits can begin to come through. Um, a lot of people won't leave because of that monetary aspect, and that they then feel like tied to stay. And so people had kind of warned, like, if you want to get out, you should probably get out now. Or, just kind of like whispers of conversations. And I knew deep down, I knew I couldn't stay there, but I was worried, what is everybody going to think? I didn't want to disappoint people, my family, like, of course, ultimately it came down to not disappointing my parents, who, had set me on this path of get your degree, land in this career, get said stable career, stay there for 30 years. And here I had landed the dream job at the #1 hospital, and I knew that I could not stay. And ultimately, I had to make a choice that I couldn't abandon myself, and I had to do what was right for me. And so I left. I left. I handed in my resignation. My supervisor said to me, kind of kindly, kind of a little bit coyly, I don't know. I knew she thought I was crazy. I knew she didn't really actually think I was going to leave. She said, "You'll be back. You'll be back." I did not go back. I haven't been back. I didn't even take a PRN supplemental job there. I couldn't. And that was the first step in me living in my purpose, living on purpose, with intention, even when it didn't make sense on paper, even when everybody thought I was crazy for leaving. The good salary, the good benefits, stable career. Again, I loved my work colleagues, but purpose, when you're really living from your heart, soul purpose, inner wisdom, whatever you want to call it, purpose won't ask you to abandon yourself. And that's what I was doing, showing up to that job every day. I was abandoning myself. I was abandoning what I really wanted. Even if on paper it looked like I was living in my purpose, I couldn't keep going there. The anxiety, the depression, I was becoming a shell of a human, and it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense why I was dreading going to work, even though everybody's like, you've got the dream job. So I had to quit. I had to walk away in order to stay in my purpose. Now, admittedly, I didn't just go and start my business the next day. God, no. There was a lot of things that had to happen in between. So this is part 1. And this will be a 2 or 3 part series. I'm not sure. But I want you to know that living in your purpose can sometimes feel messy. It can sometimes not make sense, because you're doing this thing that everybody else around you might look from the outside in and be like, what are they doing? That's crazy. That's okay. That's okay, because you will know. You will know, because it's not to say that when I left, when I handed in my resignation, when I even had someone in authority, my boss, say to me, basically, you're going to regret this. And she said, you'll be back. The noise started, yes, the like, oh no, oh shit, did I make a mistake? The like, oh no, what are they thinking? Clearly, they obviously think I'm making a mistake. My parents would have said the same thing, like, I think she's making a mistake. They probably did say that. But inside, I had never felt more free. Inside, I knew that was the first step of me not abandoning myself, regardless of the noise and the chatter. And I'm going to share in the next episode about how obviously I had to begin to learn how to deal with the noise and the chatter and the supposed to's and really look at my people pleasing and perfectionistic tendencies. That was the next part of my journey. But that was a step in beginning to live in my purpose on purpose. All right. I'll see you in part 2.